Okay, so we're just going to introduce ourselves first. My name is Richard Gowing. I'm an Associate Director of Ecology at WSP in the UK. I'm based in London, England, and my day-to-day role is to manage the ecology teams in our southern counties in England. I'm a habitat ecologist and a botanist by training, so that's where I come into this biodiversity offsetting world. And actually, most recently, I've been tasked with leading our natural capital land strategy service offering. The idea is to support clients with this fastly growing, newly emerging market of environmental credits. Ben, could I get you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rich. And hello, everybody. I'm Ben O'Hickey. I'm a senior consultant with the WSP Natural Capital and Biodiversity team. And my work predominantly focuses on the UK water sector, but more and more in the natural capital land strategy, both in the UK and internationally at the moment. A lot of the work that I do focuses on supporting clients around offsetting strategies, whether that's purely biodiversity net gain strategies within the UK or looking at internal, external carbon offsetting strategies. And a lot of my work's focused around GIS systems and models, trying to quantify natural assets, natural systems, and the potential carbon stocks and sequestration from different habitats and different habitat changes. So yeah, working with Rich closely on our land strategy sector and service offering. I think you're just on mute. Sorry, Rich.
Oh, thank you. The old mistake. I was just saying we're just going to disappear off camera for the start of the presentation, but we will be back at the end to answer any questions. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to set the context and the need for offsets, both biodiversity and carbon offsets. We're going to go through some of the guiding principles and talk about securing delivery, so securing robust delivery of these offsets. We're going to give you some examples of good practice, and this is going to be drawn from recent WSP project examples, so they're nice and fresh and we've worked on them. And then we're going to give you some concluding remarks, bringing all of these things together at the end. The session is going to run for approximately 20 minutes as a presentation, and then we'll leave good time for questions and answers at the end. And like I say, we'll pop back on camera so you can see us then. Just to point out, if you want a copy of the presentation, it's in the handout box on the system you've logged in on, so that should be available. And if you want to ask questions, please can you pop them into the question box, and we'll pick those up at the end. We won't take questions as we go through, we'll tackle them at the end. Okay, so over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Rich. So as you mentioned, our initial plan is to kind of talk around the context, which I think is a very important aspect when we approach offsets both from biodiversity and from carbon. And starting with carbon, as it's probably the slightly more mature market and the more mature concept, the net zero agenda isn't really anything new. I'm sure most of the people, if not everybody on this call, has had some dealings with it and is aware of it as a requirement. Many businesses, cities, governments, including WSP ourselves, have committed to taking fast action towards net zero, and that revolves around the reduction of their emissions. A lot of the emission reduction that's occurred previously is focused on things such as decarbonising supply chains, but as companies decarbonise further, there's likely at some point they're going to hit a ceiling where there are no more efficiencies or reductions that can be found, leaving residual emissions that need to be tackled if these companies are going to meet net zero commitments. And as these deadlines get closer, there's a greater and greater demand for methods to tackle these residual emissions through carbon offsetting. This is leading to a big growth in the carbon offsetting market, which is brilliant as it's a vital part of tackling the net zero strategy. However, as we'll kind of discuss, if this is left unregulated and without an overarching plan, it's going to start placing a lot of pressures on rural communities, ecosystems in which the changes are happening, and other areas as well. So there's a real need for setting out the carbon offsets as a robust and reliable system.
Thank you. And just to set out the corresponding context for biodiversity offsets, this is very UK focused and specifically England focused, so I apologise for people joining from other regions. In the UK, there's been an earth shift really in the last year in the way we deal with biodiversity in a development context, and that is the Environment Act 2021. You can access a copy on our government's website if you're interested. A lot of you will already know this, so for the benefit of others. The Environment Act, what it does is it shifts on the conversation, the way we deal with biodiversity and development, away from a small focus on a small number of protected species and largely qualitative approaches. It brings in a much more holistic way of dealing with biodiversity and introduces more quantitative methods of tracking stocks of biodiversity. The Environment Act introduces a 10% biodiversity net gain requirement, and that has to be maintained for 30 years. So it's quite ambitious. That is to be measured via the Natural England Biodiversity Metric. Again, you can access that freely downloadable on our government's website if you just Google those words. Interesting, a lot of content. We're in a transition period currently, so this will become mandatory from approximately winter 2023. But really, the world of biodiversity offsetting has happened in the UK now, and we're really waiting for, we're mobilising ourselves and preparing ourselves in readiness. And as this is the same for carbon, there's a real challenge and need for systems and processes to ensure that these biodiversity offsets are equitable and delivered with high integrity.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. And so when we set out and we have the aim of this high integrity and a reliable system to deliver offsets, whether it's within biodiversity net gain, but specifically looking at the carbon market, there's a real need to start at the beginning. If we approach this by purely looking at the offsets that are available, there's a real danger of missing the point and making some mistakes before we even get started. So a really good place to start is kind of looking at what are the key principles that need to be followed. And luckily there's tools such as the Oxford Principles, which have been developed as a key resource for the delivery of a rigorous voluntary net zero commitment by governments, cities and companies. And this has been developed by kind of leading academics and research, and really sets out some of the ideas that should be followed if a carbon offset is to be reliable and high quality. And this really features around aspects of avoiding the greenwashing pitfalls, so focusing on things such as cutting emission, using high quality offsets, and regularly revising the offsetting strategy as best practice evolves. Principle 2 is around shifting away from emissions reduction into a carbon removal offsetting strategy. So moving away from a focus of investing in technologies potentially like wind energy, and instead moving to projects that are physically removing carbon from the atmosphere. Principle 3 is when we look at those options, focusing on long-term storage options, and we will cover this a little bit when we look at the natural solutions, which maybe don't quite reach this, but obviously the shorter lived the storage option, the higher the risk of it being reversed or declining over decades. So a real focus on long-term storage options. And I guess the final principle that needs to be followed is supporting the development of the market and creating long-term agreements to help suppliers, generating sector-specific alliances, and the point that we'll keep coming back to is focusing on ecosystem protection and restoration. So moving forward from those principles, which hopefully everyone can agree with and sign up to, then there's the more specific standards and guidance that we can follow to ensure that the carbon offsets that either people are developing or people are buying are robust and meet the required standards. So there's lots of standards that have been developed both in the UK, such as the Woodland Code and the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, which focus on specific habitats and processes within UK systems and are designed to support UK projects and ensure they meet the required standards. There's also a whole range of different international standards which people can sign up to, such as the Gold Standard and VERA, as shown here. And these are, as I said, internationally focused, so allow for more flexibility in the types of habitats they consider and the type of projects they support. But these really provide a really good guideline to the type of products that should be considered, and either by ensuring the offsets you're providing or the offsets that you're buying meet these standards, it goes a long way to ensure we're meeting the principles that were just discussed. The second key point that is becoming more and more topical on this factor is additionality. The Woodland Carbon Code in the UK recently has undergone an update specifically around this and looking at how to ensure that offsetting projects are additional, in that they refer to carbon sequestration over and above that which would have happened if no payment had been made for carbon credits. So it's really important when we consider these options that they aren't existing habitats, they aren't existing projects, and they aren't part of business as usual. These have to be projects and actions that have been taken that are taking additional carbon out of the atmosphere that would never have happened if it wasn't for the offsetting and the process itself. So having agreed upon principles and having looked at certain standards, there's then the issue of choosing what offsets are available, and the offsetting market is growing and more options are becoming available to both buyers and suppliers. A lot of these are now focused on technological offsets, things such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and the commonly discussed and perceived silver bullet of things like direct air capture. A lot of these technological offsets meet a lot of the Oxford principles, if not all of them, provide long-term carbon storage and removal of carbon from the atmosphere. However, there's often issues around cost and scalability at the moment. Direct air capture is brilliant, but it isn't available for all companies, and it's coming at a very high price. And what this means is that when we're looking at people trying to get reliable and suitable carbon offsets, they're having to go down the natural offset means. And again, there's a huge range of different options, and that's very relevant to your geographical location, both of your company and where offsets are being provided. Elements such as woodland and peatland are probably a lot more mature. As mentioned, in the UK, we have specific woodland carbon code and a peatland carbon code, which provide guidelines and measurements about carbon sequestration and offsetting units and areas of woodland that need to be used. Internationally, elements such as coastal wetlands are very important, and standards such as VERA really focus on coastal wetlands, and they're considered a really good opportunity to sequester carbon within a ecosystem. And then finally, soils and seagrasses and other habitats are under investigation for kind of their reliability in terms of permanently sequestering carbon. But what this does mean is that for the majority of companies, the carbon offsets which they'll have to choose is referring to a case of a permanent habitat change. And I think this is really where carbon offsetting and biodiversity net gain or biodiversity offsetting really start to intersect. And it starts to ask the question of whether, when we're considering our principles for carbon offsetting, whether we actually also need to consider the principles that are driving biodiversity net gain and biodiversity offsetting, as the deliverability of these habitats will ultimately be the defining factor of whether the carbon is sequestered or not. So on that note, I'll pass back over to Rich, who will talk through the principles around the biodiversity net gain offsetting and the overlaps, and maybe where there's room for more of a joint view on these principles and standards.
So in the same way that you've seen there's a set of standards for the carbon offset agenda, there is an equally and counterposing set of standards for the biodiversity offset space. I won't go into these in detail. Please look them up. They're and largely in the UK, we follow the Business and Biodiversity Offset Programme standard. Number one is absolutely paramount, isn't it? We should avoid at all costs before we go down the offset route. We should never jump to offset as a first option. So I'd like to just stress that one. I'd like to sort of group 5 to 10 as well, because I generally see these as the ones that pick up on socioeconomic aspects of offsets, and that is vital. We talk about the ecology all the time, don't we? But if they're not accepted in societies that they're delivered in, and if they're not economically viable, they won't be successful offsets. So these standards are paramount, and they're the ones that we use as equal weighting to the quantitative part of our BNG assessments when we undertake them in WSP. We can move off this slide. So we just wanted to take a couple of slides just to take you through the practical on-site delivery challenges of delivering successful offsets. Sometimes it's kind of quite easy to forget the ecology in all this talk of credits and units and metrics, etc., etc. So we need to bring ourselves back down to what's happening on site. We use a habitat-based system in the UK, and that's great. That seems to work quite well. It's quite a catch-all. High-quality habitats tend to support species, but not always, and there are exceptions. And it would be a shame if we delivered offsets that worked for habitats but not species. So I think there's definitely a gap, a developmental gap here, to ensure that we do get the right outcomes for species. Location is paramount. I'd like to just dwell on this issue for a small amount of time. Some areas are inherently better for biodiversity, and some areas are inherently better suited for the creation of habitats. We need to think strategically. We can't just deliver offsets chaotically across the landscape. That would be the wrong way to go. And there's a debate in the UK currently about on or off-site delivery. Perhaps on-site gives you the opportunity to deliver some of the social economical benefits around offsets, and off-site potentially bigger, larger, maybe. But I think we need to move the conversation on from that. We should get the strategy first and the location right in the first place, and decide what those offsets are intended to deliver before we kind of worry about that. As we look to offset delivery, robustness, and making sure these things work, with the habitat-based system we have in the UK, it places a great emphasis on habitat survey skills. So I'll just leave that with you. This is something that we as a sector need to really work hard on. Good offsets will be monitored accurately and we'll know what's there, but that does depend on the right skills to do that. The role of the land manager is paramount. Beyond the scientific ecologist, the traditional way of assessing these things, we need people that can know how to practically manage land and create habitats. And that might relate to the sort of wider financial context in which large estates are managed. And we need those sort of people. They'll bring in a whole range of new professionals into this space beyond ecologists, and you can see a list there. And a key challenge for us is getting the regulatory framework correct. Our government agency for the environment has just finished a consultation on the regulatory framework, and it involves things like registers of all offset sites and also mandatory biodiversity net gain management plans. But the strength, the effectiveness with which this comes forward will dictate how effective these offsets are. So we just wanted to talk you through a couple of WSP case studies, and then we'll bring our presentation to an end and we'll open the floor for questions. This was a project we carried out in a southern county in England, Hertfordshire. A really exciting project for us because we were given the opportunity to generate a biodiversity baseline for an entire British county. Now, if you're joining us from the US or Oz, you'll probably find this is quite a small area, but in a UK context, this is a huge area. We did this using a GIS algorithm, so we're really quite pleased with this piece of work. What this does is it gives us a basis for planning strategically. As I've just said, the importance of where offsets go is paramount. We can use scenarios to model demand and supply of offsets and advise our client, the county in this case, on that basis. Although I would say the commission stopped at the baseline, but that's the future ambition. The WSP and teams involved in this project were biodiversity and GIS and remote sensing predominantly.
Thanks, Rich. So yeah, building on that example, which I think is kind of a really nice example of the scale in which we can start to look at these opportunities. I just wanted to talk you through kind of what is a really nice internal journey. So this is a client that WSP has been working with for the last 6 years, and they're an international spirits company, and they've got quite a large footprint and estate within the UK, but also internationally. And WSP initially started working with this client to help them understand kind of key sustainability megatrends and the relevance of those to their businesses. So our initial kind of conversation with this client was with our sustainability and climate change team. And then that's developed into helping them create a really strong environmental and sustainability strategy, which looks at a number of different elements, including their net zero commitments, but also their biodiversity commitments. So that presented a really nice picture for what they could do or what they needed to do within their own estate. And we follow that up with on-site surveys looking at the biodiversity and the habitats within their estate, both within the UK and internationally. And that allowed us to generate a biodiversity and a carbon baseline, to look at the landscape, to monitor the ecosystem services on one of the sites using a WSP tool known as the Nature tool, which looks at ecosystem services, and also looked at opportunities for things such as mangrove restoration. And what this allowed us to do was to help this client look at the potential within their own site for carbon insets to meet their net zero commitments under things like the peatland code, so looking at peatland that they own within their Scottish estates, but also within potentially woodland carbon code through transition of habitats, and also internationally through mangrove restoration. So it's a client that really set out the principles first, and they're on their journey towards carbon or insetting as to meet their own sustainability standards. And the second example I wanted to talk through, again, is UK-based. It's a UK charity known as called the Land Trust, who operate green and community and park spaces within the UK. And the Land Trust, similarly to the previous client, wanted to understand the opportunity within their own estate. However, this is very much looking at entering the biodiversity net gain market and also potentially the carbon offsetting market. This client owns large areas of land within the UK, and they wanted to look at what opportunities there were within their estate. So this included carrying out, firstly, a GIS, remote sensing analysis, similar to the one that Rich mentioned, but then following that up with on-site botanical surveys and using ecological skills there. That was then used to assess the opportunity for biodiversity improvements within certain habitat types, but also the carbon stocks and sequestration potential for the estate, and the current works undergoing at the moment looking at what potential is there for carbon offsetting and the number of units that could be generated. Overall, this is going to allow kind of the priority of investment within habitats so that they meet the need within kind of local and regional markets, and that the Land Trust are able to provide offsets that are needed by people, and are kind of meeting the needs of local recovery strategies, but also the needs of kind of businesses and local authorities. And I think both these projects are just a really nice example of how a project can start initially as either a sustainability strategy with our climate change team or an ecological site survey, but then bring in different elements such as our GIS team or the natural capital team to bring together a more holistic view of how the offsets can be delivered across large estates and for kind of a very different range of clients. And what's really good about the Land Trust is the fact that all of these habitat changes would be openly accessible due to the nature of their estate, and that's where these offsets are providing more than just a single service, but actually starting to bundle together different ecosystem services and benefits, which is really where we want to kind of try and go with this field. And I think that's how Rich is going to finish this presentation.
Thank you. So we just wanted to leave you with a model, I guess. Hopefully it's been quite clear as we've been moving through this presentation that we think offsets are at their strongest, most robust, most deliverable when they're tightly meshed within a socio-economic and environmental, obviously they're environmental features, but social and economic context. They'll be accepted if they work in those contexts, and also they should be equitable. That's a main thing, and democratic. This is the nature-based solutions framework. We're trying to encourage a lot of our clients to see things from this broader perspective rather than just channeling down into carbon and biodiversity, albeit we do help with those sort of more narrow focuses as well. But it just opens up a wider way of looking at things. I'll give you a few examples. By taking this kind of approach, you can realize multiple benefits. So for example, a biodiversity offset could be a flood alleviation area, provide access to nature and recreational opportunities, and potentially conserve soil, for example. Another aspect of taking this broader approach is it avoids unintended consequences. And by this, it can capture a range of different things, but particularly if you, in delivery of a carbon or a biodiversity offset, you inadvertently degrade another ecosystem service. By taking this broad perspective, you hopefully avoid that. I'm thinking of things like planting trees on peatland, probably not a good idea. Equally, there's some bad press around at the moment, isn't there, about using large swathes of the British uplands for single uses, i.e. tree planting, and that maybe comes at the expense of rural economies and communities. So by taking this more holistic framework approach, you really stop those kind of problems occurring, or at least you try to. So I just want to leave you with this framework as a way of wrapping up the session. You can turn to a short... There we go, apologies. So some conclusions and next steps. The key thing always, and hopefully we've stressed this, is to reduce emissions and avoid habitat loss as far as possible. Please, please think this way before going down the offsets routes. They are a last resort, they have to be. Look at carbon and biodiversity together, and hopefully we've showed you some ways in which that can occur. And as the last slide just pointed out, consider how your offsets can maximize co-benefits to local nature and people. Make sure those offsets are fitted and tightly meshed within regional and spatial strategies, and adopt nature-based solutions. It's one framework that really helps you to kind of realize the greatest benefit. Right. Hello.
Thank you, Ben and Richard, for a fantastic presentation. So just before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform. And also you can download the PDF version of this presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. We received some fantastic questions from people who registered. I will start with those and we will go to the live questions as well. The first one is how to encourage, refrain and reduce over restore and renew in the mitigation hierarchy so there are less impacts to offset.
Yeah, this is a great one, isn't it? I mean, hopefully we've covered this several times. Absolutely, this should be the way we should go. We shouldn't, offsetting should be the last resort. It's a kind of it's the thing we do after impacts are unavoidable. We're quite fortunate in the UK in that the metric we use strongly discourages development on the best quality habitats, and hopefully the market should recognise that. It should make it too expensive, too difficult to offset those habitats. But of course, there will be examples in which it happens. So my other approach to responding to this question might be to adopt that nature-based solutions or another framework, ecosystem services. There's plenty of comparable frameworks, but by showing the value of that land holistically, you're able to provide much more weight over its protection. I don't know, Ben, if you've got a perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add that I think early engagement and early education is really important. It's much harder to reduce impacts when designs or strategies have been implemented, and the International Spirit Company is a really nice example of that. That they're not currently concerned about whether the offsets are kind of not up to the right standard because they've done the initial work at first, looking at how they can reduce and refrain. And I think early engagement, early education, and showing people that this isn't a silver bullet, that they're going to have to do this at some point, is probably the best way forward, whether that's being biodiversity or whether that's carbon.
Thank you. The next question is, what in your opinion is the single biggest thing we can do to make the transition to net zero and nature positive fair for all?
Happy to start on this one, Rich, and I'll pass over to you. I think, well, possibly from personal experience, I think stakeholder incorporation is the big thing from me. Nature-based solutions are brilliant, but they have to be designed for the people that are going to use them. There's obviously another discussion around ecosystem services and whether that human-centric view of environment and nature is a way forward. But if we are going to go down that, and it looks increasingly like we are, it has to be designed for the people that are going to be using it. And by generating, for the example that Rich used, flood alleviation as part of a habitat bank or a habitat creation that's approved or is fit for the people that will be benefiting from it, I think is the best way to get buy-in and kind of generate the momentum of that snowball. So yeah, for me, I think it's kind of stakeholder engagement and stakeholder cooperation as part of the design of these elements.
That's really interesting for me, because I come from a traditional ecological scientific background, and I think sometimes ecologists and land managers might have to accept compromise and really accept and realize that the views of stakeholders and the public are equally valued. So place those views alongside ecological science. It sounds quite scary. I do suspect that quite often they'll be aligned. So I don't fear the outcome of doing that, but there may be compromises to make and trade-offs. And ultimately, the sustainability of an offset will only work if it's accepted by the local community. You can have the best offset in the world if it's incompatible with the way that land needs to be managed or the way the local community want to manage that land. It won't work. So I think there is a reality check for us as professionals working in this field, and the need to acknowledge non-specialist views.
Thank you. Next question is the UK looking at the minimum project area size for offset projects?
We had a short chat, Ben and I, before the presentation. We thought this one might come up, but there is an official minimum size, and it's very small in the UK. It's kind of I think it's a half a hectare would be the sort of minimum viable size, and that's to do with habitat function. Below that size, and arguably that size is too small, it doesn't become functional. Obviously, we wouldn't want to have lots of 0.5 hectare offsets. It's just not it's not something that would actually work for biodiversity. However, when you think about dense urban areas, we also wouldn't want to, and the socioeconomic or community benefits that providing nature close to where people live can bring. We shouldn't exclude, we shouldn't be too kind of precious about size sometimes. So I think it all relates back to having this strategy. Don't be sidetracked by how big it should be, where it should go and what function it should serve. We need that first, and then the offsets come second. Obviously, avoidance comes first again.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'm forgetting the name of the council now. I believe it was Wakefield. One of the councils in the north of England recently put a lot of work in to generate wildflower seeding along a lot of their trunk roads. And so if you were to view that as individual kind of habitat banks, they would all be very small areas. But as a combined network along the road scheme, it's had a massive impact. And I think that's a really nice example of they've considered the actual habitat generation itself, as opposed to this is potentially a habitat offset. They've actually considered, what are we trying to do? What's the minimum size as part of it? And in that case, very small areas working together have produced a really kind of good network. But yeah, as Rich said, I think that's probably where the ecologists probably need to come in on that side of it.
Thank you. I will take the last question, and any additional questions that were asked will be answered directly by email by the presenters. So the last question is, how do we avoid a situation whereby sites, areas, or locations are being used for offsetting and may then be later for development?
I'm happy to start on this from a carbon side of things, Rich, and pass over. So the standards which I referred to often detail that it has to be a permanent land use change. So the Woodland Carbon Code, for example, which is the UK carbon offsetting standard around creating woodland, it has a number of different ways of managing woodland within it, which can include kind of rotational coppicing, etc. But kind of key to it is it's a permanent land use change. So you would hope that by kind of going through that process of agreeing the principles and signing up to the correct standards, these offsetting areas will be have to be protected as part of kind of either policy, planning legislation, or kind of local plans. And that's kind of just purely from a carbon perspective, but obviously, Rich, from a biodiversity net gain, I suppose from a UK side of things, it's very specific, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's just an interesting one, and I'm sure that plenty of people, we haven't cracked this one yet, to be perfectly honest. So the requirement in the Environment Act is 30 years, which, you know, we all know, a decent tree would struggle to grow in 30 years. So there are some real problems there. So, you know, avoidance is key. We shouldn't be removing habitats that take a lot longer than that to develop. I've heard it said for debate that if we can get lots of land managed for 30 years in a good way for biodiversity, great, let's do it. The state of the British countryside at the moment, you know, that would be a massive change. So there is that way of thinking about things. Another perspective is, you can imagine this sort of mosaic habitat where you've got patches of land popping up for 30 years, but in a strategic, coordinated way, which could also provide the stepping stones for wildlife. So, you know, wildlife adapts to changes in the landscape frequently. It may actually could be designed in a beneficial way. The final thing I would say on that is that I hope, and it is our hope, that the way the biodiversity market evolves in the UK is that offsets are provided in advance. So they're ready and they're mature when they're needed to be purchased as credits. So therefore, I would hope that you'd have them for longer than 30 years. You know, you'd be buying. It's greatly advantageous for a developer to purchase a mature unit. It gives them a lot more. The way the metric works, you get many more biodiversity units for your token area by buying a mature unit. So I would say all of those three things. But honestly, we need to. This is where the regulatory framework comes in. We haven't cracked this one yet.
If I could just make one last point on that, Rich, so I think you made a really good one. I think this is almost where the power is with the offset buyer. And think of the examples we gave, the land trust, for instance, those areas of land will be managed in perpetuity. So they provide a supplier of, well, either biodiversity offsets or carbon offsets, which come with a guarantee that it will never be developed on. And I think that's really where we need responsible buyers in this market, or a market that's allowed to develop in a good way, where people offering units that are there in perpetuity and aren't just potentially there for 30 years under a land rental agreement are given a kind of additional status or kind of preferred. And that's also where people managing this within their own estate has this added benefit, because they're then in control of keeping it for perpetuity as well. So the ball is in the court of the people buying offsets and making sure that they set the standards that they want, really.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with the presenters via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ben and Richard, for a fantastic presentation.
Brilliant, thank you.
Joining everyone. Yep.